Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into a topic that I think a lot of people find pretty mysterious.
Yeah.
Borderline personality disorder, or BPD. And we've got a whole bunch of research and insights from Stokit.nu and its AI-driven podcast discussions. And we're really going to try to get past those common stereotypes about BPD and really understand what it means to live with it.
And that's such an important mission because BPD often gets labeled as this misunderstood diagnosis. And we really need to kind of unpack that and see how stigma and misconceptions really affect the way BPD is perceived and experienced.
It's almost like there's this wall of judgment that gets built around BPD.
Absolutely.
And it makes it so much harder for people to even talk about it or seek help.
Yeah.
So let's try to break that down. What are some of the most common misconceptions and why are they so harmful?
Well, I think a good way to think about it is imagine experiencing this really intense emotional pain. And instead of getting support, you're hit with all these labels.
Right.
Like you're manipulative or difficult or attention-seeking.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the reality for so many people with BPD. And these stereotypes, they just don't address the pain that's underneath. And they make it so much harder to get the right kind of help.
It's like blaming somebody for having a broken leg instead of offering a crutch
Yeah, right.
and, helping them to the hospital.
Exactly. And then on top of all of that, BPD can also be mistaken for other conditions.
Oh, really?
Yeah, things like bipolar disorder, ADHD, or PTSD. There are some overlapping symptoms, which makes it even trickier to get a proper diagnosis.
So we're dealing with this complex condition, and it's surrounded by all this stigma, and then it can be misdiagnosed sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's no wonder that it's so misunderstood.
Right.
So let's get into what it actually feels like to live with BPD. Our source material describes it as kind of like an emotional roller coaster. So what does that actually look like day to day?
Okay, well, imagine feeling your emotions. Way bigger than most people. So something that might be a minor annoyance to somebody else could trigger this huge wave of anger or sadness or anxiety for someone with BPD. And it's not just about feeling them stronger, it's also about how quickly those emotions can change.
Oh, wow.
Going from one extreme to the other in a really short amount of time.
So it is like being on a roller coaster then?
Yeah, it really is.
But how does that play out in real life?
Well, our source material has this really interesting example. Imagine having a disagreement with a friend. That's pretty minor. But for someone with BPD, that could feel like the end of the world.
Wow.
It's all those old wounds and fears of abandonment get ripped open, even if it's not really that big of a deal.
Speaking of abandonment, that seems like a pretty central theme when it comes to BPD.
Right.
And it's got to be more than just not liking to be alone, right?
Oh, for sure.
So what does this fear of abandonment really feel like?
Well, it's this really deep primal terror of being rejected or left behind or forgotten. And that fear can be so powerful that it actually leads to behaviors that push people away.
Really?
Yeah, think about it. You're so afraid of being abandoned that you become really clingy and demanding. You're constantly seeking reassurance. Or, on the other hand, you might withdraw completely and isolate yourself to avoid even the possibility of rejection.
So it's like you're trapped in this self-fulfilling prophecy almost, where your actions are driven by the very fear that you're trying to escape.
Exactly.
And that actually brings up the whole idea of idealization and demonization in relationships that our source material talks about. Could you explain that dynamic a little bit?
Sure. So it's complicated, but basically at the start of a relationship, someone with BPD might put their partner on a pedestal, see them as perfect and all-powerful. But then even a small disagreement or any perceived threat can make them swing to the other extreme.
Right.
And suddenly that person who is idealized becomes demonized, seen as cruel or uncaring. And these sudden shifts make it super difficult to have stable, healthy relationships.
And this all ties into another core symptom of BPD, which is an unstable sense of self. Our source material calls it unstable shelf build. So can you help us understand what that actually feels like for someone with BPD?
So imagine looking in the mirror and never quite recognizing the person looking back at you. It's this constant feeling of not knowing who you are or what you want or where you belong. It's like trying to build a house on shifting sand.
Oh, yeah.
It makes decisions, agonizing relationships feel really confusing, and the future just feels totally uncertain.
I can see how all that internal turmoil would make it really hard to regulate emotions.
Yeah.
It makes sense of your relationships.
For sure.
Is that where the impulsive behaviors come in?
Oftentimes, yes. Our source material points out behaviors like substance abuse or reckless spending or making really rash decisions. And It's not about being malicious or anything. It's often just a desperate attempt to escape that internal chaos, to numb the pain or to try to feel some sense of control.
So it's like hitting that eject button when things get to be too much inside.
Right.
Even if it means you're going to have to deal with bigger problems later on. And I bet that impulsivity just kind of feeds back into the cycle of unstable relationships and reinforces those fears of abandonment.
It does, and that's exactly why understanding how these symptoms all connect is so important. It's not just a bunch of separate traits. It's about seeing how emotional vulnerability and relationship struggles and those unhealthy coping mechanisms all work together.
And that understanding is crucial if we want to move past those harmful stereotypes and create an environment that's more compassionate and supportive for people with BPD.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, before we move on, is there anything that stood out to you from what we've talked about?
What really fascinates me is how all of these symptoms, they feed into each other. They create this complicated web of challenges.
Yeah. And it just shows how important it is to look past those surface judgments and see the pain and the vulnerability that's underneath those behaviors.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's not about excusing harmful actions, but about understanding where they're coming from and offering support instead of judgment.
Exactly. And one thing I'd add is this is just the beginning of our conversation.
Yeah.
We've only scratched the surface of what it means to live with BPD.
There's so much more to unpack, and I'm really looking forward to digging deeper with you.
Me too.
So let's shift gears a little bit and delve deeper into what our source material calls the terror of abandonment.
Okay.
This seems like a really painful part of BPD, and I want to hear more about its impact on everyday life.
So as we kind of dig deeper into this terror of abandonment, I think it's really important to remember that it's not just about not liking to be alone. For someone with BPD, it's this like primal fear.
Whoa.
Almost like a feeling of impending doom if they sense that someone they love is pulling away. That sounds so isolating, like constantly being anxious about losing people you care about. But how does that fear actually play out in relationships?
Well, that's where things get a little bit tricky.
Right.
It's kind of paradoxical because this fear of abandonment can actually lead to behaviors that push people away.
Really?
Yeah. So imagine feeling so desperate to avoid abandonment that you become overly clingy or demanding. You're constantly needing reassurance. Or on the flip side, you might withdraw completely, isolate yourself to avoid the pain of rejection.
So it's like you're stuck in this riptide. And the harder you try to swim to shore, the further you get pulled out.
Exactly.
And I imagine this fear gets even worse with that unstable sense of self that we talked about.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you don't even know who you are, it must be hard to believe that anyone could actually love you.
Yeah, that lack of a solid identity
right.
can create this constant need for validation from other people.
Right.
And that can really drive a lot of the behavior in relationships.
So it's not just about being alone. It's about feeling like you're unlovable.
Yeah.
Or unworthy of connection. That's got to be a tough thing to deal with. But let's switch gears a bit.
Okay.
And talk about treatment. Like, what are some of the ways that people with BPD can get help for all of these complicated challenges?
Well, the good news is BPD is treatable.
Okay, that's good to hear.
It's not a life sentence. And one of the most effective therapies is something called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT.
DBT?
Yeah, and it teaches people practical skills to manage those intense emotions, tolerate distress, and build healthier relationships.
So it's not just about talking about your problems. It's about learning actual tools to handle things better.
And DBT focuses on 4 main areas: mindfulness, distress, tolerance, emotion regulation, and interpersonal effectiveness.
Huh. So it's like a toolbox full of different strategies for dealing with BPD.
Exactly.
But finding the right therapist who really gets BPD
and can
provide that treatment, that's got to be tough.
It can.
And not all insurance plans cover mental health services very well.
Yeah, you're right. Access to good quality mental health care is a huge barrier for a lot of people with BPD. We really need to advocate for better resources, more training for mental health professionals, and better insurance coverage.
Absolutely. We need a system where everyone who needs help can get it, no matter where they live or how much money they have.
I agree.
But what about medication? Does that play a role in treating BPD?
Well, it's important to remember that medication isn't a cure for BPD.
Okay.
It doesn't directly address those core issues, like emotional dysregulation or relationship problems.
So it can't fix those things.
Right, but some medications, like antidepressants or mood stabilizers, can help manage other conditions that often come along with BPD.
Like what?
Things like anxiety or depression or insomnia. Those can make the symptoms of BPD even worse.
So it's about managing those extra challenges. That can make it even harder to cope. But what about self-care? Like, what are some things that people with BPD can do on a daily basis to manage their symptoms and feel better overall?
Self-care is crucial. But we're not just talking about bubble baths and face masks here.
Okay, so it's more than that.
Yeah, self-care for BPD is about actively creating a life that supports emotional stability and well-being. So that means establishing a regular sleep routine, making time for physical activity, and eating nutritious food.
So it's about building a strong foundation
Yeah,
to handle those emotional storms.
exactly. And it's also about making your environment more calming, surrounding yourself with things that bring you peace.
Like what kind of things?
Well, you could try decluttering your space, adding some soothing colors and textures, or using calming scents like lavender.
Huh.
These small changes can make a big difference in how you feel.
So it's about creating a space where you can feel safe and grounded.
Yeah.
And how about managing those really intense emotions? Are there any specific strategies for navigating those tough moments?
Absolutely. One of the most effective tools is mindfulness.
Okay.
Learning to observe your thoughts and feelings without judgment. Being present in the moment without getting swept away by your emotions.
So it's like you're watching the storm from a distance, but you're not getting caught in the wind and rain.
Exactly. And that space is so important. It gives you the ability to respond to those emotions in a healthier way instead of just reacting impulsively
Right.
or getting completely overwhelmed.
And mindfulness can help you become more aware of yourself, too.
Exactly.
Like you start to notice your triggers and your patterns and your needs.
Yeah, it's like shining a light on those unconscious habits that might be driving your behavior.
And that awareness can be really empowering.
It is.
It gives you more control over your emotions and your actions. So how can someone with BPD actually start practicing mindfulness? Is it just about sitting and meditating?
Well, formal meditation is one way to do it,
Okay.
but it's not the only way. You can bring mindfulness into everyday activities.
Oh, really?
Yeah, like eating or walking or even taking a shower.
Huh. It's about bringing that awareness to whatever you're doing, noticing the sensations, the thoughts, the feelings, without letting them carry you away.
So it's about cultivating that inner observer,
Right
that
now.
quiet presence that can just watch everything unfold without getting lost in the drama.
Exactly.
But I'm also curious about creativity and self-expression. Like, how can those things help someone with BPD heal?
Creativity can be incredibly therapeutic.
In what way?
It gives you a safe and healthy way to express those intense emotions,
Okay.
to let go of pent-up energy, and to connect with a deeper part of yourself. Whether it's painting or writing or dancing or playing music, it allows those emotions to flow out of you in a positive way.
So it's like giving those emotions a voice without letting them take over.
Exactly.
And the best part is, it doesn't have to be perfect.
It doesn't.
It's not about being a professional artist. It's just about expressing yourself authentically.
Right.
But how does creativity help with self-discovery, especially for someone with BPD who might not have a strong sense of self? Well, when you're being creative, you often tap into parts of yourself that you didn't even know were there.
Oh, wow.
You might discover hidden talents or passions or ways of being that you never realized you had.
So it's like you're uncovering hidden treasures within yourself.
Yeah, exactly.
We've talked a lot about individual coping strategies, but what about boundaries? Especially in relationships where one person has BPD. How can boundaries help create healthier relationships?
Boundaries are essential for any healthy relationship, but they're especially important when one partner has BPD.
Why is that?
Well, remember all those fears of abandonment, the intense emotions, the impulsivity.
Yeah.
Boundaries create a safe and structured environment where both people can feel secure and respected.
So it's like setting up a container for the relationship
Yeah,
with clear limits so things don't get out of control.
exactly. And remember, boundaries aren't about control or restriction. They're about protecting each other from getting hurt and creating a more stable and loving connection.
What are some examples of healthy boundaries in a relationship where one person has BPD?
Well, one important area is communication. Both people need to be able to express their needs and feelings openly, but you can also set boundaries around how those conversations happen.
Okay.
Like maybe you agree not to have serious talks late at night when emotions are running high,
That's a good idea.
or you decide to take a break if a conversation starts getting too heated.
So it's about creating a safe space for communication
Exactly.
where everyone feels heard and respected.
Yeah.
What about boundaries around behavior?
Those are really important too. You might talk about what behaviors are okay and not okay.
Like what?
Things like yelling or name-calling or making threats.
Right.
And you decide on consequences for crossing those boundaries.
Like what kind of
Be
consequences?
taking a time out, or sleeping in separate rooms, or even seeking professional help.
So it's about holding each other accountable, but in a loving and supportive way.
Exactly.
But what about friends and family members of people with BPD? They must face their own challenges.
They do.
How can they support their loved one and take care of themselves at the same time?
That's a really important point. Supporting someone with BPD can be really tough.
Yeah.
And it's essential for loved ones to prioritize their own well-being.
So how can they do that?
Well, first they need to understand that BPD is not a choice. It's a mental illness that requires professional help. And they can't force their loved one to get treatment. But they can offer support, encouragement, and resources.
So finding that balance between support and boundaries is key.
Yeah,
And remembering that you can't pour from an empty cup.
exactly.
You have to take care of yourself too.
And education is huge. The more loved ones know about BPD, the better equipped they'll be to handle those complicated dynamics.
Makes sense.
They also need to learn to set healthy boundaries for themselves, like saying no to requests that feel overwhelming, or limiting contact if it's becoming too draining.
So it's about realizing that you can't fix someone else's problems, but you can be there for them in a healthy way.
Right.
And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is take care of yourself. But amidst all these challenges,
Right.
we have to remember there's hope.
Yeah.
There are people who have overcome BPD.
Yeah.
And found healing and happiness.
There are.
Do you have any examples of people who've done
Oh,
that?
there are so many inspiring stories of people who have navigated BPD and come out stronger and wiser and more connected to themselves and others.
That's amazing to hear. Like who?
We'll take Marsha Linehan, for example.
Okay.
She created dialectical behavior therapy, and she lived with BPD herself.
Wow.
And her journey of healing became the foundation for DBT, which has helped millions of people.
It's incredible to think that the therapy that's helped so many people came from someone's personal struggles with BPD.
It is.
It's proof that people can heal and transform.
It really is. And there are many other stories of people with BPD who have found their own paths to healing. Some have become successful artists or writers or entrepreneurs. They channel their emotions and creativity into something meaningful. Others have become advocates for mental health awareness. They use their voices to fight stigma and create a more compassionate world.
So it's about finding your own way to make BPD a part of your life
Yeah.
without letting it control you.
Yeah.
And I imagine there are lots of people who have found healing through therapy and medication and lifestyle changes.
Absolutely.
They've learned to manage their symptoms and build healthy relationships.
Recovery is a journey, and it looks different for everyone. But what these stories show us is that healing is possible. It might not be a straight line, and there might be setbacks along the way. But with the right support and a commitment to self-care, people with BPD can create a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling.
It's about finding hope, even when things are tough, believing that a better future is possible, and taking steps towards healing, even if they're small steps. Now, before we move on to our last segment, I'd love to hear what's resonated with you most from our conversation so far.
What really stands out to me is how resilient people are. Despite the huge challenges of BPD, people are finding ways to heal and grow and create lives filled with purpose and connection. It's a testament to the power of hope and the importance of support and how much therapy and self-care can help.
That's a great way to put it, and I think it's the perfect lead in to our final segment, where we'll talk about some practical tips for dealing with BPD and some resources for people who need help.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground talking about like the emotional ups and downs of BPD and the challenges that come up in relationships. So now I think it's time to get practical.
Yeah.
What are some things that people with BPD can actually do to handle those tough moments and feel more stable in their everyday lives?
Well, one of the most important things is to create a solid routine. It might sound basic, but having a consistent sleep schedule, eating regular meals, and getting them exercise can really help to ground you.
Oh, I see.
When everything else feels chaotic.
It's like having those little anchors throughout the day
Exactly.
to keep you from drifting too far.
And along with routine, it can be really helpful to create a calming space for yourself.
Oh yeah, like your surroundings can definitely affect how you feel.
Absolutely.
So what kind of things can people do to make their environment more peaceful?
Think about colors, textures, scents. Surround yourself with things that make you feel relaxed, like soft blankets, calming colors, Maybe some lavender or chamomile.
It's like creating your own little sanctuary, a
Exactly.
place where you can escape when things get to be too much.
And speaking of escaping, we've talked a lot about mindfulness. Are there any specific practices that you think are helpful for BPD? Even just taking a few minutes to breathe deeply can make a huge difference.
Oh yeah, I do that sometimes when I'm feeling stressed.
It really works.
What else?
You can also try guided meditations. There are tons of apps and websites with those. And don't forget about bringing mindfulness to everyday things.
Oh, right, like how?
When you're eating, really savor each bite. When you're walking, pay attention to how your feet feel on the ground. It's about bringing your attention back to the present moment over and over again.
So it's like training your mind to stay grounded,
Yeah,
even when your emotions are trying to pull you in a million different directions.
exactly.
But what about when those really intense emotions do come up? What are some healthy ways to cope?
Journaling can be a great way to process your emotions.
Yeah, I like to write things down too.
It helps to get those thoughts and feelings out of your head. Talking to a trusted friend or therapist can also be really supportive. And don't underestimate the power of doing things you enjoy, whether it's listening to music, spending time in nature, or being creative.
Right, it's about finding those things that lift your spirits and
Yeah.
make you feel good.
Exactly.
But I know it can be hard to find the right support.
Hmm.
Are there any organizations or resources that you recommend for people with BPD and their loved ones?
Absolutely. The National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder, or any ABPD, is a fantastic resource.
Okay, what do they offer?
Their website, borderlinepersonalitydisorder.com, has tons of information about treatment options, support groups, personal stories.
So it's a good place to start.
And the National Institute of Mental Health, or NIMH, also has a lot of information on their website. That's nim.ni.gov. They cover everything from symptoms and causes to treatment and research.
Wow, so that's super comprehensive.
And if you like reading personal stories, I highly recommend The Buddha and the Borderline by Kira Van Gelder.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one.
It's a really powerful memoir about her journey of recovery from BPD. And for friends and family members who are trying to understand BPD, Stop Walking on Eggshells by Paul Mason and Randy Krager is a really helpful guide.
What kind of stuff does it cover?
It gives practical advice on things like setting boundaries, communicating effectively, and finding support for yourself.
So there's help out there for everyone involved.
Yeah, and remember, if you're ever feeling overwhelmed or like you're in crisis, the crisis text line is available 24/7. You can text HOME to 741-741 to talk to a trained crisis counselor.
And that's totally free and confidential, right?
It is.
Those are all such great resources. It's good to know that people don't have to go through this alone, and that reaching out for help is a sign of strength.
Absolutely.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on BPD, I think the biggest takeaway is that it's not a life sentence.
It's
It's a challenge, but it doesn't have to define you. With the right support and treatment and self-care, people with BPD can live really meaningful and fulfilling lives.
I completely agree.
And remember, you deserve love and happiness and a good life. Keep learning, keep growing, and keep believing in yourself. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into borderline personality disorder. We hope you found it helpful and encouraging. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.